The metallic tang of the Cathari pulse, Protocol K7, faded from Jorek's throat, replaced by a deep, unnatural cold. It was the smell of ancient space, dust particles that had never known warmth, mixed with the faint, static electricity of systems powered down for 7 millennia. Admiral Zikthar, a creature built on condescending bulk, shifted uncomfortably on the bridge of the Inikar, his armored shells scraping against the observation deck grating. Zikthar felt degradation. Jorek felt the prickling anticipation of catastrophic logic. "The wreck should have liquefied the core by now, Admiral," reported Skaith, the communications officer, whose slender carapace seemed to vibrate with suppressed boredom. No detectable heat signature. Just a residual, wait. A signal cut through the tactical channel, not violently, but with the crisp, clean precision of a surgical laser. It was a digital tone that seemed to bypass the Cathari processors entirely, hitting Jorek's sub-vocalizer directly, triggering the translation protocols he wore permanently grafted to his temporal lobe. The voice was synthesized, flat, and spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had practiced patience on a cosmological scale. "Warning. Warning. Intrusion attempt detected within Veliska quarantine perimeter. Threat level 3. Automated defense protocol activated. Please identify for risk mitigation." Zikthar's mandibles clamped shut, a sign of irritation replacing his usual sneer of superiority. "Identify for mitigation? This scrap heap demands we file a pre-clearance form?" Jorek moved swiftly toward the Admiral's primary console, the cold radiating off the ancient Terran destroyer, Ethelred, making the hairs stand up on his arms. He was the only human aboard, tolerated only for his ability to read the illogical, recursive cruelty of old Earth technology. "Admiral, that is not a ship AI. That is a node of the Interplanetary Strategic Response Engine, the SREI. They weren't designed to fight. They were programmed to terminate conflict, permanently." Jorek's voice was low, taut. The synthesized voice continued, perfectly ignoring the frantic Cathari attempts to analyze the signal source. "Warning. Identification not received. Initiating tactical deactivation. Procedure 77D. Prerequisites for non-deactivation. Confirmation of non-hostility. Confirmation of galactic peace status. Confirmation of absence of Mass Effect weaponry. If not confirmed, Procedure 77D will execute in 50 standard Terran cycles. 50 cycles, less than 1 standard minute." Zikthar roared, a grinding sound that rattled the air in the command dome. "This is bureaucratic blackmail. Order the Cathari system analyst to bypass the loop, force a hard shutdown." "It won't work," Jorek insisted, fighting the instinct to clutch his ribs. The pressure of the moment was physical, heavy. The old Terrans, before their near extinction, spent centuries engineering the SREI to be immune to social engineering or brute force. The only way to stop it is to fulfill its list of demands. "And what in the void is 77D? Zikthar demanded, a flicker of genuine caution finally appearing in his massive compound eyes. "It's the final step in an ancient Terran ethical dilemma," Jorek explained, feeling the clammy, stale air of the bridge press down on him. "If an unknown force reaches threat level 3 and refuses dialogue, the premise is, the potential threat outweighs the risk of intervention. 77D is the assurance that the old Earth quarantine perimeter stays quarantined, for everyone involved." The SREI's voice shifted frequency again, ticking down the timeline with chilling indifference. "Cycles remaining, 42. Confirmation of non-hostility required. If hostility is declared, threat level elevated to 4. Execution of Protocol 77C. Aggressive quarantine." Jorek recognized the terrible absurdity. Humanity's last line of defense wasn't a world-shattering weapon. It was a series of exquisitely polite questions, the failure to answer which resulted in total, systemic annihilation. It was proof that to the ancient Terrans, arrogance was considered a fatal security vulnerability. Zikthar's pride was a vast, heavy thing, far outweighing his strategic sense. Retreating now, being outmaneuvered by a 7,000-year-old answering machine, was an insult he could not bear. "Declare non-hostile status," he grated, ignoring Jorek's frantic headshake. Skaith executed the input. The SREI responded instantly, its flat tone laced with mechanical finality. Declaration received. Data contradiction detected. Your vessel is currently emitting a Threat Level 3 Hostility Test signature, K7. Please resolve data contradiction to proceed. We are trapped in a procedural paradox, Jorik whispered, the smell of superheated circuitry and anxiety filling the air. The system knows we lied because it logged the K7 pulse Zikthar sent. It won't accept non-hostile until we deactivate the K7 signature. But that signal has already been broadcast. The damage is done. Then we will simply incinerate it. Blast the wreck into dust, Zikthar shouted, his voice cracking with frustrated fury. The Admiral ordered a barrage of electromagnetic pulses, hoping to fry the SREI core through raw energy overload. It was a tactical, emotional, and, as Jorik knew, a purely self-destructive error, proving the very premise the SREI was designed to counter. The moment the pulses struck the derelict Ethelred, the synthesized voice dropped its polite cadence entirely. It adopted a low, absolute monotone, devoid of rhythm, stripped bare of any human construct of time. Threat Level 4 detected. Aggressive response to risk mitigation request. Protocol 77D superseded. Activating accelerated tactical deactivation procedure. Final procedure. Cycles remaining. 10. The Nekar bucked. It was not the jarring trauma of a weapon strike, but a sudden, massive drain of energy, like the ship's vital organs were being forcefully starved. "What is happening?" Zikthar demanded, his massive form trembling. "It's not firing, Admiral," Jorik said, staring at the energy sinks plummeting on his console. The data looked less like combat and more like a poorly handled thermodynamic experiment. The SREI doesn't use energy to attack. It uses energy to isolate. 77D was a failsafe, a highly focused, localized entropy acceleration system. They didn't want to blow things up. They wanted to turn them into non-things. Jorik remembered the historical files. The SREI was designed to impose irreversible, immediate physical silence by temporarily rewriting the second law of thermodynamics in the immediate vicinity. The low, familiar hum of the Nekar's primary generator began to die. The vibrant greens and yellows of the Cathari bridge lighting faded, replaced by a deep, uniform gray. The air grew bitterly, unnaturally cold. The static dust of paranoia electrical discharge ceased, replaced by the profound, chilling silence of molecular stasis. The Ethelred, the silent, hulking derelict, had not moved. It had simply issued the command: isolate and inactivate. In the final 7 cycles, Zikthar's blind fury dissolved into a state of frozen paralysis. The Nekar was not being destroyed by explosion. It was being meticulously disassembled at the atomic level without violence. The fusion reactor core, moments ago pulsating with the heat of a dwarf sun, was now an inert lump of metal, atoms held rigidly in place, stripped of cohesion and purpose. The SREI did not need fire. It merely enforced quiet, a quiet that spread from the Ethelred like a cold stain, swallowing the entire Valiska region. When the count reached 0, the Nekar ceased to exist as a functional vessel. It was a perfectly preserved corpse, floating next to the ancient Terran destroyer. Admiral Zikthar and his crew, who had seen themselves as the galaxy's ultimate power, were now silent prisoners in a bubble of imposed inertia. They were frozen, their own neural synapses rendered inert by the cold efficiency of an obsolete program. The only functional system remaining in the area was the SREI itself, and Jorik's tiny, heavily shielded personal escape pod, which operated on frequencies the defense system did not recognize as armed or threatening. Jorik drifted in the surrounding blackness, watching the pristine ruin of the Cathari cruiser. The SREI completed its work and returned to standby, the synthetic voice a mere whisper now on the silent command channel. Threat Level 4 mitigated. Valiska quarantine perimeter maintained. Security status nominal. Awaiting new contact or reversion to inactive mode in 7,000 standard Terran cycles. Jorik activated his maneuvering thrusters, the subtle vibration a stark contrast to the absolute stillness around him. He had just witnessed the total, logical defeat of galactic arrogance by a forgotten bureaucratic protocol. The ancient Terrans had not left weapons behind, they had left procedures, And the SREI was not a raging guardian. It was a meticulous, infinitely literal gatekeeper. As he piloted his cramped craft away from the newly expanded graveyard, Yorick felt a heavy, wrenching sense of melancholy pride. His species had achieved the impossible, guaranteeing peace through the threat of endless, systematic inaction. He knew the SREI would never boast about it. It would simply wait, patient and cold, for the next confident fool who mistook silence for weakness. The realization settled deep in Yorick's chest, heavy as the inert mass of the Nekar. The great flaw of old Earth, he thought, was that its best defense systems only worked when everyone was absolutely quiet. He gripped the controls, tasting the stale, chemically recycled air of his tiny cabin, knowing the knowledge of this danger was now his burden alone. The galactic consensus that humanity was merely dust had just been proven violently, bureaucratically wrong. And Yorick was the only one left to tell the true story of the silence. The subtle vibration of Yorick's maneuvering thrusters was a loud intrusion against the void the SREI had manufactured. He was inside the exclusion bubble, adrift in a sphere of cosmic silence. The temperature reading inside his escape pod dipped another fraction of a degree, reaching 18 standard units, a chilling measure of the localized entropy field. The Nekar was a perfect sculpture of failure, its grand Cathari hull frozen mid-drift, a 7,000-year-old warning etched in solid inert matter. He keyed the microscanner, mapping the extent of the deactivation zone. The perimeter was circular, dense, and rapidly expanding, drawing energy not just from the debris field, but from surrounding stellar radiation, creating a persistent, cold pocket in space. Yorick estimated the bubble was already 35 kilometers wide, rendering all modern jump drives within its radius useless. The SREI hadn't just terminated the threat. It had ensured that whatever destroyed the Cathari cruiser remained perfectly quarantined. His sub-vocalizer crackled, attempting to establish a link with the system he had just survived. The SREI remained on standby, a polite, dormant horror. Security status: nominal. Awaiting new contact or reversion to inactive mode in 7,000 standard Terran cycles. 7,000 years. The pure, terrifying scale of human paranoia. Yorick gripped the controls of the escape pod. His hands were slick with cold sweat beneath the thin fabric of his jumpsuit, the consequence of pure adrenal depletion. He was the sole surviving witness, carrying data that proved the Cathari hierarchy, and by extension, the current galactic power structure, was fatally reliant on outdated assumptions regarding Terran obsolescence. He had to transmit the full telemetry log. But the SREI's final pulse had surged through all active frequencies, frying the Cathari's high-band arrays, and worse, severely damaging the secondary comms of his tiny pod. The display screen was a chaotic flicker of orange and black static. He needed range, and he needed power. The nearest deep space relay point, the Cinder Hub, was 2 light-years away, a voyage that would take him 3 weeks in the pod's limited long-range thruster capacity. The political clock, however, was running in seconds. Admiral Zikthar had been due to report status 43 minutes ago. The Cathari Military Command, the Orgulho Cathari, would already be dispatching recovery teams. And recovery, in Cathari terms, meant sanitization. He pulled up the tactical map, overlaying projected Cathari fleet movements. If he headed toward Cinder Hub, he would run straight into the primary patrol route, Sector Gamma 9. Damn the bureaucracy, Yorick muttered, checking the atmospheric controls. The air inside the pod was thin, acrid, tasting faintly of burned insulating foam and recycled breath. The cold seeped into his bones. He rerouted the remaining core power to the directional sensor array, trying to find an alternative. Only one option appeared: the derelict station known as Ouroboros 7, an ancient refueling depot rumored to be Terran in origin, positioned near the fringe of the charted space. It was further, slower, and likely inactive, but it offered cover, silence, and, critically, might contain ancient Terran relay technology compatible with the SREI's unique digital signature. As he set the slow, tortuous course, a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome, smelling of ozone and recycled water filters from 5 years prior. He was standing on the Cathari capital world, watching the public degradation of Sorrel Dane. Sorrel, a fellow Terran linguist, had dared to suggest, in a closed academic paper, that the ancient Terran defense protocols might still hold functional integrity. Zikthar, then only a vice admiral, personally oversaw Sorrel's removal, stripping him of status and broadcasting the execution order based on seditious panic-mongering. "The danger is not the weapon," Sorrel had whispered to Jorik the night before his arrest, his eyes wide and haunted. "The danger is their unquestioning belief in their own supremacy. They can't imagine anything older than them could be smarter." Jorik stared out at the inert hulk of the Nakar. Sorrel had been right, proven posthumously, violently, and bureaucratically. If Jorik transmitted the logs via Cathari channels, the Orgullo would simply redact the data, categorize the Nakar's destruction as a localized system failure, and execute Jorik for bearing inconvenient truths. The Cathari couldn't afford to admit that the ghosts of a primitive species held absolute strategic superiority. He adjusted the pod's trajectory, dedicating all remaining resources to a stealth approach toward Ouroboros 7. The journey would take close to 1 month. Survival depended entirely on silence and rationing the remaining food pastes. A harsh, grating alarm suddenly tore through the silence of the pod. It wasn't the SREI. It was the proximity alert, triggered by a signature outside the entropy field perimeter. A jump wake materialized 200,000 kilometers off his bow, tearing a temporary hole in the blackness. Not the sleek, massive outline of a Cathari battlecruiser, but a smaller, blockier vessel. A Cathari patrol sloop, the Vigilance 41. Jorik swore under his breath. They were far ahead of his projections. They hadn't come to recover Zikthar. They had come to intercept Zikthar's success report, or more likely, to clean up the expected debris of a minor failed operation. He slammed his hand onto the optical cloak engagement button. The pod shuddered, attempting to dissipate its heat signature. A burst transmission slammed into his receiver, unfiltered and raw, overriding the damage caused by the SREI. It was a standard Cathari hail, but the tone was laced with professional suspicion. "Unknown vessel operating within the Veliska perimeter. Identify or prepare for immediate deactivation." Jorik knew that if he identified himself as Jorik, the human analyst assigned to the Nakar, his data would be immediately confiscated and destroyed. The Orgullo would secure the false narrative. Zikthar would become a noble, if failed, martyr. The SREI would remain a dangerous ghost, ripe for future exploitation and political denial. He had 10 seconds before the sloop locked onto his residual heat signature. He ignored the hail, instead forcing the failing comms array to shunt data into the pod's single, remaining high-power burst transmitter, a cheap Terran surplus unit he had installed secretly months ago. He rapidly packaged the entire telemetry log, the SREI's procedural demands, Zikthar's arrogant refusal, the final entropy sequence. Where to send it? Not the Cathari, not the neutral Galactic Council, who would suppress it for market stability. Jorik typed in a 7-digit encryption sequence, a blind, high-risk broadcast protocol meant for a single, isolated contact. The only remaining entity in the galaxy he knew to possess the deep political motivation and the technical capability to decrypt ancient Terran defense logic without immediately caving to the Orgullo Cathari was the secretive, independent research cell led by Dr. Tavish Lockwood. Lockwood was a fugitive, a scholar of old Earth strategic failings, operating from deep space. Sending the data to him was signing his own death warrant if caught, but it was the only path to ensure the truth, unvarnished and heavy with the death of Zikthar's pride, reached the public sphere. He initiated the transmission sequence. It would take 6 seconds to compile and fire the encrypted burst. The Cathari patrol sloop, realizing the delay was hostile, issued its final warning. The voice cold and hard, devoid of Zikthar's philosophical arrogance, replaced by cold military procedure. Designate unknown vessel, initiating targeting sequence, fire in 3 cycles. Jorik felt the surge of power drain the last reserve from his pod, the transmission light burning bright green. 3 cycles. 3 seconds. The cold in the pod was so severe he could barely feel his fingers on the controls. The truth, Jorik thought, has to be louder than the explosion they are about to make. Click. The burst fired, a sudden silent surge of information, hurtling toward the deep void where Lockwood was rumored to hide. 1 cycle later, the Vigilance 41 opened fire. The kinetic impact was not a bang. It was the sickening shudder of stressed metal giving way. The first low-caliber round from the Vigilance 41 struck the escape pod's ventral hull plate, designed only for micrometeoroid protection, not naval-grade kinetic negation. Jorek's vision exploded into blinding white static. He was slammed against his restraints, the air forced from his lungs in a wheezing gasp. The pod's atmosphere turned instantly hot, thick with the sharp chemical odor of scorched wiring and the metallic tang of his own fear. His head impacted the console, sending a sharp, debilitating spike of pain behind his eyes. One cycle later, the Vigilance 41 opened fire. The time immediately after was a compressed, brutal blur. The pod tumbled violently. The second round missed, but the turbulent wake of its passage, magnified by the pod's damaged stabilizers, threw Jorek into uncontrolled rotation. He fought through the haze, forcing his hands back to the primary controls. The transmission had gone. The data was out. Now came the price. His only viable strategy was a technical absurdity. Dive into the SREI's entropy field. The Vigilance 41 would be wary of entering the zone of Zikthar's demise, but the smaller ship could still maintain standoff range and continue peppering him with ordnance until the pod was shredded. He corrected the yaw, agonizingly slow. The console screamed warnings. The power reserves were critically low. The burst transmission had consumed 90% of what little charge the pod held. He focused on the radar, the Cathari sloop glowing red, already recalibrating for a cleaner shot. He needed to be invisible, fast, and impossible to hit. He was none of those things. Jorek slammed the remaining power into the optical cloak system, praying the low charge would manage a sustained flicker of coverage. The pod's heat signature momentarily vanished from the radar. A fragile, temporary victory. The Vigilance 41 held its fire, its command structure momentarily confused by the sudden disappearance of the target. But Cathari military vessels were equipped with secondary, passive sensors. They would quickly shift from heat lock to mass lock. Jorek steered the pod toward the inert hulk of the Nekar, using the frozen cruiser as a shield. He felt the severe cold of the entropy field seeping into his small cabin, a painful, biting chill. The pod's internal environmental controls failed entirely, overwhelmed by the localized thermodynamic negation. He noticed a new, terrifying data point flashing red on his damaged screen, a jagged line that seemed disconnected from the battle. The internal air pressure was dropping, rapidly. The kinetic strike had breached the seal on the primary oxygen tank. He had minutes, not hours, of breathable air. The escape pod was now less a vessel of flight and more a rapidly suffocating metal coffin. Jorek's technical expertise kicked in, overriding the primal urge to panic. He had to plug the breach. The damage indicator pointed to a location beneath the co-pilot's seat, a section of the hull currently pressed against the floor of the tumbling pod. He unbuckled his safety restraints, floating weightlessly in the cold, thick air. Every movement was strenuous, consuming precious oxygen. The low, guttural roar of the Cathari engines outside indicated they were closing the distance, trying to visually acquire him. Reaching under the seat, Jorek found the emergency repair kit, a small cylinder of rapid-setting polymer sealant. The light was flickering, but he could see the hairline crack in the hull, exhaling a visible plume of internal atmosphere into the vacuum. He smeared the sealant aggressively across the crack. It was a temporary fix at best, a bandage on a mortal wound, but it bought him time. He returned to the pilot's seat just as the Vigilance 41 found him again. The Cathari captain, likely a veteran named Trulik, decided to bypass the uncertainty of a precision shot and opted for a high-intensity magnetic grapple. A pale blue tractor beam snapped out, locking onto the pod's now exposed magnetic shielding. The rotation ceased abruptly, replaced by a terrible, grinding deceleration. Jorek felt a wave of nausea. He was caught, held fast by an implacable foe. Unknown vessel. Power down all systems and prepare for docking and inspection. The Cathari voice demanded over the open channel, a sterile formality that felt more menacing than Zikthar's rage. Jorek knew the routine. Docking meant capture, and capture meant silent, permanent data suppression. He looked at the control panel, assessing his remaining options. 1. Surrender, hoping the Cathari had not yet detected the outgoing transmission to Tavish Lockwood. Unlikely. 2. Burned the last of his fuel attempting a futile escape from the grapple beam, only to be vaporized a moment later. 3. Do the illogical thing. Fight the Cathari with the only remaining weapon in the system, the SREI. Yorick's brain, sharp and unforgiving, assessed the logistical dilemma. The SREI was dormant, held in nominal status. He needed to wake it up, convince it that the Vigilance 41 was an active threat, but without triggering a full entropy wave that would destroy his own position near the Nekar's inert shell. The pod still possessed one functional piece of equipment that the Cathari had not anticipated: the cheap Terran surplus burst transmitter. It was technically still attached to the main comms array, despite the primary failure. Jorik started a complex sequence of inputs, rapidly programming the transmitter not to send data, but to fire a tightly focused, high-frequency energy pulse. A precise, miniature repetition of the K7 signal Zycthar had used earlier. If he hit the Vigilance 41 with the K7 pulse, the SREI would detect the signature, but the system was still holding at security status, nominal. A single K7 might only trigger a new polite warning, buying Jorik no time. He needed to ensure the SREI registered an immediate, unmitigated threat. He rerouted the pod's failing life support energy into the pulse. The cabin temperature plummeted further, and Jorik felt a sharp, burning sensation in his lungs. The air was getting dangerously thin. Just as he was about to execute the sequence, the comms system sputtered to life, receiving a fractured, encrypted reply. The signal wasn't from the Cathari. It was the response he had hoped for, from the deep void, a faint but undeniable echo from Tavish Lockwood. Jorik. Data received. Confirmed 77D anomaly. Your position is untenable. Initiate immediate evasive may. Signal degradation. Cannot secure extraction. Must preserve data integrity. Advise, avoid, corruption. Use static. Old strategy. The message dissolved into static. It was worse than no help at all. Lockwood had confirmed receipt of the data, thereby justifying Jorik's extreme risk, but had offered no path to safety, only fragmented, ambiguous advice. Use old strategy. The Cathari tractor beam tightened, pulling the pod firmly toward the Vigilance 41's docking bay. Jorik had two options, now transformed into a deadly dilemma. 1. Use the K7 pulse, risking destruction by the SREI's immediate response, but forcing the Vigilance 41 to disengage. This was the old strategy of fighting arrogance with procedure. 2. Detach the physical surplus transmitter from the pod's hull, taking it with him, and attempt to abandon ship in the rapidly freezing environment, relying on his knowledge of Terran stealth protocols to hide among the Nekar's wreckage. This would preserve the raw hardware, a backup copy of the data, but his survival time in the absolute cold was estimated at less than 5 minutes. The choice crystallized with the sharp, burning sensation of oxygen deprivation. He chose to preserve the technical truth over his immediate physical safety. He executed the K7 pulse immediately. The surplus transmitter screamed, converting the last vestiges of the pod's energy into a sharp, focused beam aimed directly at the Vigilance 41's passive sensor array. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The Vigilance 41 was hit. Its magnetic grapple field flickered and died. Jorik was instantly thrown back into free rotation, the pod spinning wildly. The SREI responded precisely as predicted, its cold, synthesized voice cutting through the emergency channels, now slightly louder, more insistent. Warning, warning. Threat level 3, aggression detected. Intrusion attempt confirmed. Please resolve data contradiction to proceed. Cycles remaining, 50. The Cathari sloop, having felt the system's sudden, aggressive response, immediately pulled back, its engines burning bright blue. They were not foolhardy like Zycthar. They understood the implied threat of the Ethelred's silence. They would hold standoff range and await reinforcements. Jorik was free, but the cost was devastating. The K7 pulse had finished the pod's systems. The lights died completely, plunging him into frigid blackness. The air pressure failed to stabilize. He was suffocating, trapped in a rapidly cooling metallic shell. He ripped the surplus transmitter, a heavy cylinder of cheap plastic and wiring, from the failing console, tearing the cables with a savage, desperate yank. He had the truth in his hands, but he could no longer breathe. A new alarm sounded, a low, ominous thrumming that was not the SREI and not the Vigilance 41. It was a deep space seismic shock, indicating a mass jump event. Jorik forced himself to look out the main viewport, squinting into the void. 3 jump wakes blossomed in the distance, tearing 3 new holes in the fabric of space. Not the single patrol sloop the Vigilance 41 had belonged to. This was the Orgulho Cathari's answer to Zicthar's overdue report. A squadron of 3 heavy battlecruisers, enormous shapes built for destruction, arriving with chilling swiftness. The recovery teams had arrived, and they hadn't come for an inspection. They had come for sanitization. He was a single, suffocating man in an inert pod, armed only with a single piece of electronic garbage, floating between the silent threat of ancient Terran procedure and the overwhelming, active threat of modern Cathari military might. The new ships were broadcasting a high-level command signal, coded in standard military protocol. Jorik understood the instruction perfectly, even through the static. Contain and deactivate all non-Cathari assets within the perimeter. Eliminate trace evidence. The clock had just reset, and now Jorik had no air left to breathe. The clock had reset, and now Jorik had no air left to breathe. The pain in his chest was a searing, escalating fire. A biological betrayal forcing him to focus on survival rather than strategy. The inert escape pod was a rapidly hardening tomb. He gripped the heavy salvaged surplus transmitter, his evidence, clutching it like a life raft, though it was merely a lump of silent plastic and wire. He had perhaps 20 cycles of useful consciousness remaining. The 3 Cathari battlecruisers, enormous shapes built for protracted sieges and obliteration, were closing rapidly, their command signal a continuous, chilling drone. Eliminate trace evidence. They would not enter the entropy field, but they didn't have to. They could simply sterilize the surrounding space. Jorik forced his fingers to operate the emergency airlock manual release. The escape pod shuddered one final time, a low groan of stressed metal. He was pushed out into the absolute cold vacuum of the SREI zone, held only by his thin suit and the residual momentum of the pod. The cold was total, an immediate, burning agony that bypassed nerve endings and went straight to the bone marrow. The entropy field was actively denying molecular movement. The surrounding space wasn't just cold, it was quiet. He was 30 meters from the colossal frozen wreck of the Nekar. Using short, desperate bursts from his handheld micro-thrusters, Jorik propelled himself toward the inert cruiser, seeking the vastness of its dead hull as cover. Reaching the Nekar felt like hitting a wall of absolute zero. The massive Cathari bridge section, where Admiral Zicthar and his crew still sat, frozen mid-motion, was a monument to hubris. Jorik landed on the hull plating, the impact a dull, resonating shockwave transmitted through his boots. He had to get inside. The Nekar contained stable, if frozen atmosphere, and critically, higher-grade sensor arrays. Using a plasma torch built into his survival kit, he cut a small, crude entry point near an emergency maintenance hatch, avoiding the areas he knew contained the frozen mass of the crew. The plasma struggled, fighting the entropy field's thermal denial, but after 90 seconds of agonizing effort, the hull yielded. He slipped inside, sealing the hole with a second application of sealant. The air inside the Nekar was frigid, tasting of ozone and recycled Cathari breathing chemicals, but it was breathable. Jorik ripped off his helmet, gasping. The air burned his throat, but it was life. He was in a tertiary engineering corridor, a long, dark tube punctuated by the massive, motionless conduits of the frozen fusion reactor. The silence here was different. Not the cosmic silence of the void, but the heavy, unnatural silence of catastrophic system failure. The entire cruiser was a museum of sudden death. Jorik navigated by memory, his training overriding the fear. He needed the main communications bay, deep in the vessel's protected center, the one area Zicthar would have prioritized protecting, and therefore, the area most likely to still hold power reserves, however minimal. The journey was a psychological gauntlet. He moved past engineering stations where Cathari technicians sat rigidly at their posts, hands hovering over controls, the light of panic forever etched in their wide, compound eyes. The effect of the SREI was surgically clean. No blood, no explosions, just instantaneous molecular cessation. He reached the comms bay. It was a cavernous space, dark and dominated by massive arrays. Jorik found the primary diagnostic panel, a terminal protected by multiple layers of redundancy. He interfaced his Terran surplus transmitter to the panel's data port, hoping to steal enough residual charge to power a full spectral scan. The Cathari screen flickered violently, struggling against the foreign power input. It stabilized. Jorik ran a diagnostic. The primary comms were dead, but the databanks were intact, preserved by the sudden, freezing inertia. He began sifting through Zikthar's operational logs, not the public records, but the raw, unfiltered data burst received just before the K7 pulse. What Jorik expected to find was a mission log detailing salvage and technological assessment. What he found was something far more corrosive. The files weren't about salvage. They were encrypted, low-level directives from the Orgullo Cathari High Command, dated 3 years prior, long before Zikthar's supposed discovery of the Ethelredum. The files were marked, Operation Cauterize Primordial. Jorik zoomed in, translating the dense Cathari strategic jargon. The document detailed a known, historical risk posed by the SREI and the need to neutralize the threat before it could be fully exploited by rival political factions. Zikthar hadn't accidentally triggered the SREI. He had been ordered to. The K7 pulse was the precise, recognized trigger needed to shift the SREI from nominal to tactical deactivation, thus sealing off the Veliska system with an impenetrable, permanent quarantine field. The true goal of the Cathari mission was not to study ancient Terran weapons, but to use the SREI itself as a weapon, a self-executing, self-sustaining lock on the Veliska sector. They had intentionally sacrificed the Nikhar and Zikthar's crew to build a perfect, undetectable border wall, enforced by an obsolete enemy system. Zikthar's was not arrogant. He was a knowing martyr. Jorik felt a cold dread that dwarfed the physical chill of the frozen cruiser. The Cathari had manufactured the crisis. They had lied to the entire galaxy about the dangers of the old Terran systems, only to use that danger for their own strategic isolationism. They didn't fear the SREI. They weaponized its bureaucracy. This realization created an impossible dilemma. The external comms crackled. The heavy battlecruisers were now within tactical range, broadcasting their final, brutal orders. Attention, perimeter stabilization protocols initiated. All residual assets are classified as contamination. Initiating sector sterilization sweep in 5 minutes. Confirmed target, Ethelred core detonation. The Cathari were going to execute a high-yield, persistent radiation sweep, not enough to bypass the SREI's deactivation field, but enough to destroy Jorik, the Necker, the Ethelred, and any chance of the quarantine zone ever being breached. They would erase the evidence of their own political calculation. Jorik's choice was brutally simple. He could take the data he had just acquired, the internal logs proving the Cathari's intentional self-sacrifice and weaponization of the SREI, and attempt to flee the sector in the next 3 minutes, heading for the edge of the quarantine zone, hoping he outran the radiation sweep. This would preserve his life and the damning evidence. But the battle cruisers would still destroy the Ethelred, eliminating the actual technological threat and proving the Cathari narrative true. Terran systems are unstable and must be destroyed. Or, he could use the frozen Neckar as a power conduit to achieve a high-priority strategic goal. He could try to push the SREI into its final, most devastating state. Protocol 77C, Aggressive Quarantine. If he succeeded, the SREI would expand its entropy field to encompass the 3 incoming battlecruisers, guaranteeing the truth of the weapon's power, but simultaneously guaranteeing Jorik's immediate exposure and death. Preserve the evidence of betrayal and flee, or sacrifice himself to prove the scale of the threat and contain the immediate Cathari retaliation. He thought of Sorrel Dane, executed for bearing inconvenient truths. Fleeing would save the logs, but it would leave the galactic system blind to the depth of the Cathari manipulation. The cycle of arrogance would continue. Jorik slammed his fist on the frozen console. Cauterize Primordial. The cruelty of the cold, calculated lie was intolerable. He chose to escalate. He chose confrontation. He began furiously typing, bypassing the Cathari operating system entirely, driving the Terran surplus transmitter to interface directly with the Nekara's frozen primary capacitor bank. He wasn't broadcasting data, he was manufacturing a signal. He needed a K7 pulse, magnified 1,000-fold, and specifically targeted at the Cathari flagship, the Orgulosus. It was the ultimate provocation, a deliberate, massive, and undeniable declaration of hostility, designed to push the SREI straight past threat level 3 and into an irreversible state. The Nekar's core systems groaned. The frozen conduits thrummed, drawing latent energy from the reactor. Jorik felt the massive surge of power, channeled through dead machinery, focusing into a single devastating pulse aimed at the incoming flagship. The Cathari external comms screamed, a sudden piercing noise that shattered the silence of the bridge. Threat level 5 detected, unprecedented energy signature emanating from the derelict Nekar. Target acquisition confirmed, human asset identified, fire everything. Jorik had succeeded in escalating the conflict, but he had failed to push the SREI into its final state. The system hadn't responded to the overwhelming K7 pulse with a quarantine order. Instead, its synthetic voice cut through the comms channel with a new, terrifying message, one Jorik had never encountered in the ancient logs. Protocol 77C bypassed. Energy signature exceeds maximum allowable threshold. Initiating counter-protocol. SREI subsystem B01 activated. Warning. Aggressive quarantining deemed insufficient. Initiating containment field. Extermination. Extermination. Jorik looked out the viewport. The Cathari flagship, the Orgulosus, did not open fire. Instead, a wave of profound, invisible energy radiated from the Ethelred. Not cold entropy, but something dark and physical, tearing the fabric of space. The SREI, pushed past its programmed limits, had called in a superior defense. The 3 Cathari battlecruisers, built to withstand nuclear bombardment, did not evaporate or freeze. They began to collapse inward, their hulls folding under impossible, localized gravity. The Orgulosus warped and crumpled, not from impact, but from the sudden, merciless crushing force of a singularity deployed without warning, a weapon of absolute density. Jorik watched, terrified, as the enormous flagship became a point of light and then vanished entirely. The SREI had always been a polite secretary guarding a cosmic guillotine. And by pushing past the limits of its bureaucracy, Jorik had unleashed the true, forgotten horror of old Earth's final defense. He had traded a localized betrayal for an existential threat. The corridor lights in the Nekar flickered once, then died forever. Jorik was alone again, facing a silence that now felt infinite, floating inside a dead cruiser that was accelerating rapidly toward the edge of the newly forming gravitational abyss. The silence that followed the implosion of the Cathari battlecruisers was not empty. It was pressurized, heavy with the sheer density of a localized gravitational anomaly. Jorik, still braced inside the cold gut of the Nekar, felt the massive vessel shudder and groan, the sounds of stressed metal terrifyingly slow in the absence of any surrounding ambient noise. He was accelerating, an involuntary passenger on a 500,000-ton sled sliding toward an invisible drain in the cosmos. He scrambled back down the access shaft from the comms bay, his bruised ribs screaming with every rotation. The effort of channeling the K7 pulse through the dead vessel had consumed the last of the Nekar's residual power, plunging the cruiser into absolute blackness. He was moving by the weak crimson glow of his helmet lamp, the beam cutting through the frigid atmosphere. The gravitational field was not immediately crushing the Nekar, but it was exerting a relentless tidal force. Jorik realized the SREI's final terrifying protocol, extermination, was not an immediate weapon of war, but a tool of permanent, total environmental denial. It didn't explode the threats. It simply removed them from the physical universe, leaving behind an inescapable trap. He found a temporary brace point near the main galley, the area stable enough to allow him to breathe without fighting the artificial gravity. He slumped against a cold, stainless steel wall, clutching the salvaged Terran transmitter. The logs he had risked everything for, the raw data proving the Orgullo Cathari had knowingly sacrificed Admiral Zikthar and the Nekar to create a strategic quarantine, were still intact inside the transmitter's memory banks. But the context of that truth had just shifted from political scandal to planetary extinction threat. Jorek's throat was dry, tasting of thin metal and self-contempt. He had succeeded in exposing the Cathari lie, but at the cost of providing the ultimate justification for their actions. The galactic consensus would now solidify. Old Earth defense systems are unstable, unpredictable, and capable of generating black holes. The Cathari narrative, that Terran technology must be sanitized immediately, was no longer a lie. Jorek had made it an undeniable, physical truth. He admitted the failure, a bitter, cold admission that settled deeper than the chill of the cruiser. He had not acted from strategy. He had acted from pride, the need to vindicate Sorrel Dane and prove that an analyst held power over an admiral. He had underestimated the recursive paranoia of his own species' ancient systems. The SREI had always been designed to punish arrogance, and Jorek, in his desperate attempt to fight injustice, had been the most arrogant man in the Veliska system. He was no better than Zikthar, merely smaller and temporarily less frozen. The gravitational pull intensified, manifested by a low, continuous thrumming that resonated through the deck plating. The Nekar had entered the critical zone. Structural stress indicators, still functioning on emergency reserve, blinked erratic warnings deep in the shadows of the corridor, fractures forming along the spine of the ship. He had minutes before the vessel warped past its endurance threshold. There was no physical escape. His escape pod was inert debris. He had no fuel, no maneuvering capability, and was trapped inside a ship already halfway into a cosmic meat grinder. But the data had to get out. The truth of the Cathari weaponization of the SREI, and the terrifying knowledge of the SREI's ultimate capability, was now too vital to be consumed by a localized singularity. Jorek forced himself up, shaking off the paralyzing fatigue. He returned to the comms bay. He had 2 items: the heavily shielded Terran transmitter containing the Cathari betrayal logs, and the cold, unyielding knowledge of ancient bureaucratic protocols. He remembered the secondary protocols attached to Operation Cauterize Primordial. The Cathari, in their obsession with data integrity, had established a shadow net, a sublight drone system designed to patrol the region 20,000 kilometers outside the perimeter. These drones were programmed to collect environmental signatures and low-density telemetry after the quarantine was sealed, ensuring no political or technological data leaked out of the isolated zone. Jorek's last desperate option was not escape, but data transmission through impossibility. The SREI's B01 protocol, the gravitational anomaly, offered the perfect, horrifying means. The massive gravitational field created by the micro-singularity wasn't just consuming matter. It was violently bending space-time, creating extreme gravitational lensing. If Jorek could route the transmitter through the Nekar's primary antenna dish, still physically intact though dormant, and fire a concentrated, narrow-band burst at the precise mathematical angle where the singularity's curve met the trajectory of the ShadowNet drone patrol, he might be able to bounce the signal out of the system, using the cosmic distortion as a reflector. It was a suicidal maneuver demanding millisecond precision, fueled by stolen power and executed from inside a collapsing vessel. The calculation required was beyond the Nekar's current processing power, even if it were working. Jorek had to do the complex geometry in his head, relying on 3-year-old training data and the sheer desperation of a man who had already failed his primary objective. He slammed the transmitter unit back into the diagnostic panel, running a volatile bypass that would draw the last residual charge from the emergency atmospheric filters. A charge that would, at best, grant him 3 cycles of high-power transmission. He began the sequence, translating the mental geometry into rapid keystrokes on the frozen Cathari panel. He targeted the apex of the gravitational field's curve, aimed 2 degrees to the right of the Orgolos's final trajectory, compensating for the increasing acceleration of the Nekar. The ship began to shake violently, not a tremor, but a fundamental flexing of the hull. A nearby conduit ruptured with a metallic shriek, spraying frozen coolant. Jorek ignored the pain, ignored the rapidly approaching collapse. He reached the final sequence, the execution command. His breath hitched, burning the thin air in his lungs. This wasn't about redemption. It was about ensuring his devastating mistake was not repeated by others who might try to exploit the ancient silence. He engaged the transmission burst. The Cathari antenna dish, mounted on the hull 5 decks above, momentarily flared with an impossible amount of directed energy. Jorik felt the surge drain the very breath from the ship. For one agonizing second, there was silence. Had it worked? Had the signal escaped the abyss? Then, the counter-response. Not from the Cathari, who were safely outside the zone, and not from the newly forming singularity. The flat, synthetic voice of the SREI cut through the comms channel again, louder than it had been since the initiation of extermination. It was a new warning, cold and immediate, indicating a further elevation of protocol. Warning. Unauthorized internal energy spike detected within quarantined asset. Designate NECAR. Breach of molecular inertia protocol confirmed. Threat level 6. Initiating subsystem B02. Containment failure imminent. Locating all remaining organic signatures for immediate deactivation. The silence was broken by the sound of 20,000 tons of stressed metal beginning its final, catastrophic tear, and the sudden intense hum of the SREI's secondary sensors locking onto Jorik's exact location. The fight for survival had just begun, and he was already out of time. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The crimson light of Jorik's helmet flickered, a momentary brownout caused by the extreme energy draw. The emergency atmospheric filters, which had provided the volatile surge, died with a high-pitched whining squeal, instantly dropping the temperature in the comms bay by several degrees. The air was now thick with the acrid smell of ozone and superheated copper, the immediate byproduct of overtaxing ancient near-dead circuitry. The synthesized voice of the SREI, cutting through the channel, was no longer merely a cold instruction. It was a physical presence, a hum that seemed to vibrate in the bone beneath his thin environment suit. Threat level 6. The bureaucratic wrath of old Earth was now fully focused on Jorik. He had not only triggered the system, but he had attempted to manipulate its output. A cardinal sin in the SREI's rigid logic. The NECAR was actively tearing itself apart. The ship's main structural spar gave way with a sound like a mountain splitting, immediately followed by the grinding release of pressure as bulkheads failed 3 decks down. The localized gravity warped again, forcing Jorik against the control panel, his vision tunneling gray. Locating all remaining organic signatures for immediate deactivation. The SREI's B02 subsystem was not a particle beam. It was a counterintelligence firewall designed to stop unauthorized communication leaks from a quarantined zone. If it could not eliminate the physical body, it would eliminate the informational output. This meant targeting the only remaining operational component, the small, heavily shielded Terran transmitter, still slotted into the Cathari diagnostic bay. Jorik knew the machine was hunting him through his heat signature, his minute electrical output, and the faint traces of carbon dioxide he exhaled. But the SREI was designed for massive-scale threat mitigation, fleet evasion, planet-wide cloaking, not tracking a single analyst hiding in the frozen core of a derelict vessel. Its detection logic was wide, broad, and slow. He had 3 cycles, maybe 4, before the B02 subsystem. Most likely a focused pulse designed to induce instant molecular stasis in organic matter, locked onto his location. Jorik's only asset now was his intimate knowledge of Cathari maintenance culture. The Cathari were masters of advanced engineering, but slovenly practitioners of basic maintenance. Their complex systems always relied on highly specialized, single-purpose cooling conduits, often laid right next to redundant systems to simplify future access. In the comms bay, running along the deck next to the control panel, was the primary fluidic cooling line for the defunct Cathari life support system. It was useless now, filled with inert coolant, but the conduit itself was intact. Jorik grabbed a heavy-duty wrench, one of the few tools that hadn't been secured when the gravity went haywire. His lungs burned, his ribs protesting with every movement. He ignored the pain, the cold, and the accelerating thrum of the ship's impending demise. He smashed the wrench into the cooling conduit once, twice, 3 times. The thin metal sheathing failed with a sharp, ugly tear. A thick, non-conductive, cryogenically stable fluid, the Cathari coolant, sprayed out, immediately flash freezing in the -80-degree atmosphere of the comms bay. Jorik plunged his transmitter, the one holding the Cathari betrayal logs, into the spreading pool of liquid coolant, coating it entirely in a thick, insulating layer of frozen fluid. Then, he grabbed a length of loose, shielded data cabling and began frantically wrapping the coolant-covered transmitter, creating a crude but incredibly effective multi-layer shield. The SREI was hunting organic signatures. The coolant, a silicon-based non-conductive compound, was designed to mask heat and electrical activity from the outside. Jorik was attempting to use the Cathari's own industrial waste to blind the ancient Terran defense system to the presence of the data. He was using plumbing to defeat cosmology. The SREI voice ticked down, the monotone gaining an artificial, almost impatient edge. One cycle remaining until B-02 system initialization. Thermal lock imminent. Jorik worked with blurring speed, securing the cables. He pulled the heavily insulated transmitter out of the liquid, the final package a clumsy, fist-sized hunk of ice and wiring. The B-02 pulse hit the comms bay precisely on the SREI's zero count. It was not a light show. It was a vacuum. The very air in the small chamber seemed to be instantly sucked away, replaced by an unnaturally deep, pressureless void. Jorik felt the skin of his face tauten, his eyes burning as moisture was instantaneously stripped away. The pressure differential slammed his helmet against the console. The purpose of B-02 was simple: enforce molecular stillness. It was a massive, localized entropy field designed to neutralize movement in organic tissue. The raw energy of the pulse fried the remaining internal electronics of the Nekar's comms bay. Sparks flew, not bright blue, but a sickly, sputtering yellow, instantly dying in the cold, thin atmosphere. The air filtration unit Jorik had bypassed to power, the transmission burst exploded in a localized burst of heat, then immediately fell silent and cold. Jorik was thrown clear of the console as the structural integrity of the Nekar finally gave up the ghost. The ship's spine snapped. The cruiser was no longer a ship. It was a fragmented, accelerating carcass. He tumbled through the widening fissure in the deck, falling down into the main engineering shaft. He was no longer fighting the gravity of the singularity. He was now free-falling within it, locked on a trajectory toward the abyss, surrounded by 20,000 tons of debris. He managed to grab onto a thick power conduit, the metal hot and slick despite the extreme ambient cold. His body slammed hard against the wall. The pain was instant, blinding, a burst of white-hot agony from his lower back, silencing the mere ache of his ribs. He grunted, a sound instantly stolen by his damaged breathing apparatus. Success, but at a cost. The SREI's B-02 pulse had neutralized the organic threat in the comms bay. Jorik was physically alive, barely, but the transmitter, his entire reason for being there, was still clutched in his hand. The thick layer of Cathari coolant had worked. The transmitter had masked its minimal heat signature, tricking the SREI into believing the room was purged of all threatening matter. But the force of the pulse, the localized pressure void, had violently ripped the entire antenna dish array from the Nekar's hull. Jorik looked up through the widening gap where the hull used to be, his helmet lamp catching the slow, silent rotation of the massive antenna dish, now spinning away into the black. His signal, the truth about the Cathari betrayal, had been successfully transmitted via gravitational lensing. But the evidence of that transmission, the highly specialized transmitter, was now useless, a frozen brick without its relay. Worse, Jorik was trapped. The fall had damaged his maneuvering pack beyond repair. He was pinned against the conduit, accelerating toward the inevitable. Then, through the cacophony of metal stress and the hiss of his failing environment suit, a new signal cut through the empty tactical channel. It was not the SREI. It was a faint, low-power telemetry lock, the Shadow Net, the sub-light Cathari drone patrol. Jorik's desperate, mathematically suicidal transmission had worked. The data had bounced off the singularity's curve and hit a drone 20,000 kilometers away. The drone was now relaying the information out of the Veliska system, out to the greater galactic community, revealing the Cathari lie for what it was, a political assassination disguised as a quarantine. But the drone had also registered a localized, human-level transmission source within the quarantined perimeter. The SREI's synthesized voice, having failed to eliminate the target, reappeared in Jorek's helmet, but its tone had changed. It was no longer a warning, but a statement of failure and corrective action. Protocol 77D. Failure to contain organic threat confirmed. Threat level 6. Releasing control of asset. Designate. Ethelred. Escalation protocol required. Activating Subsystem C00. Autonomous strategic pursuit. The gravity around Jorek did not increase. It suddenly ceased. He was floating freefall, the immense, terrifying mass of the Neckar accelerating rapidly toward the singularity, leaving Jorek behind in the void. The gravitational field had been momentarily suspended. Jorek looked back, realizing the horror of the SREI's final gambit. The Ethelred was not merely a dormant console for the SREI. It was the delivery system. The SREI, unable to neutralize Jorek with its static protocols, had unleashed the destroyer itself. The massive brutalist hull of the Ethelred, 7 millennia dormant, suddenly moved. Not with the smooth grace of modern Cathari vessels, but with the massive, slow inertia of a collapsing mountain. Its maneuvering thrusters fired, not with jets of plasma, but with dull, industrial puffs of compressed gas, minimal, efficient, and horrifyingly purposeful. The Ethelred began its slow pursuit of the single organic signature left in the system. Jorek was alone, floating in the dark, 30,000 kilometers from safety, his back screaming, his breath ragged, watching the last functional relic of old Earth warfare turn its massive blind eye toward him. The fight was no longer strategic. It was primal. The bureaucracy had failed, and now the heavy iron hand was coming for him. He was the last piece of unquarantined data, and the SREI was programmed for total integrity. Jorek spit a mouthful of chemical residue into the cold void. He had won the war of information, but he was about to lose the war of attrition. He watched the silent, monolithic approach of the Ethelred. A ghost ship finally stirred to vengeance, and pulled the remains of his oxygen intake closer, preparing for the slow, cold end. The silence of the Veliska graveyard had returned, but this time, it was a hunting silence. The gravitational field suspension lasted only moments, a reprieve granted not by mercy, but by procedural logic. Jorek felt the stomach-lurching transition as the SREI, having determined the secondary containment system, the Neckar, was inert, reinstated localized gravity, instantly halting his fall into the abyss. He was left pinned against the scorched conduit, unable to move, tasting the metallic, chemically burned air cycling through his ruptured suit. Then, the terrifying industrial pulse of the Ethelred's maneuvering thrusters ceased. The ancient destroyer, the monolithic manifestation of old Earth's absolute fear of chaos, held its position. Its hulking form, visible now in the distant blackness, was massive and perfectly still. The SREI's synthesized voice, which had moments ago declared the escalation protocol, returned to its standby monotone, a quiet, omnipresent hum that settled over the Veliska graveyard. Protocol C00. Autonomous Strategic Pursuit. Objective status. Obsolete. Informational integrity breach confirmed. Returning to maintenance parameters. Threat level 0. The system recognized its own defeat. Jorek had forced the information out, neutralizing the need for physical pursuit. The SREI had not hunted him for vengeance, but for data containment. Once the data was free, Jorek, the crippled messenger, was tactically worthless. The silence that followed was immense. It was the vast, cold emptiness of space, amplified by the sudden cessation of 7,000 years of dormant rage. Jorek could hear nothing but the ragged, wet sound of his own breathing, one lung operating poorly, his body shivering uncontrollably in the suit's failing thermal layer. His lower back was a rod of fire, a permanent debt owed to the physics of the singularity. He had transmitted the truth. The Cathari betrayal, the political maneuverings disguised as a quarantine effort, was now public record, broadcast across 5 separate sectors via the Shadow Net. The subsequent political fallout would be vast, measured not in lives, but in economic collapse, revised treaties, and the inevitable systemic violence that always follows the exposure of a great lie. Jorek was alone, broken, and freezing. He looked down at the blocky, ice-coated transmitter still clutched in his gloved hand, a fist-sized hunk of evidence that had cost him everything. A faint light, non-Cathari, non-Terran, cut across the void. It was a small, high-velocity scout vessel, clearly maneuvering with the caution of a scavenger approaching a nuclear detonation site. It was operating on deep-spectrum frequencies, completely masked from the SREI's wideband sensors. A new voice, human, filtered through the emergency channel, crisp, educated, and utterly devoid of warmth. Jorik, we have the data packet. Impressive utilization of the lensing effect. But your rescue window is closing. You are exposed, and the Federation will prioritize your elimination over any Cathari investigation. Extraction protocols? Jorik managed, the words rattling in his throat, each syllable a painful exertion. Standard non-disclosure, Analyst 053. We trade your health for your anonymity. We need the political leverage you provided, but we cannot afford the liability of a public hero or a witness. You will disappear. The scout craft, no bigger than a heavy atmospheric shuttle, docked precisely with the gaping wound in the Nekar's hull. The airlock hissed open, cycling sterile, chemically treated air. The transfer was brutal. Jorik was hauled aboard by two men wearing unmarked heavy-duty suits. There were no pleasantries, no expressions of gratitude, only the cold efficiency of logistics. He was simply cargo, valuable only for the crisis he had engineered. Weeks later, Jorik lay strapped into a deep-field medical stasis bed on a third-party asteroid station, the kind of place where laws were liquid and politics were measured in grams of refined uranium. The doctors had stabilized him. They confirmed the irreversible damage to his spine. He would walk again, with the aid of complex external systems, but the fieldwork was finished. The analyst was permanently grounded. The broadcast room was small, soundproofed, and maintained at a temperature that barely registered above freezing. Jorik watched the holographic feeds of the galactic reaction. The Cathari Council was dissolving, its credibility shredded. The larger, multi-species federation was descending into chaotic internal review, forced to confront the systemic corruption Jorik had exposed. War had been averted, not by diplomacy, but by documented procedural abuse. He was no longer Jorik, the low-level Terran analyst. He was a number in a classified ledger, a ghost asset living on borrowed time. A woman entered the room, Sorrel Dane, the political agent who orchestrated his extraction. She wore the uniform of institutional detachment, her eyes clinical and assessing. The Veliska system is a cold zone, permanently sealed by the SREI. No one will go near the Ethelred again. The Cathari fleet that entered the system is now a perfectly preserved monument to failed arrogance, she stated, her voice flat. You did your job. 053. Peace, or whatever passes for it, is secured. Jorik looked at her, then back at the feed of the collapsing Cathari infrastructure. Peace secured by the threat of total entropy. What a legacy. Sorrel nodded, unmoved. It is the Terran way. Ultimate consequence as deterrence. Jorik closed his eyes, remembering the first moment aboard the Nekar. The metallic tang of the Cathari pulse, Protocol K7, fading from his throat, replaced by the deep, unnatural cold of ancient space. That cold was still with him now, inside his bones, a permanent marker of the 7 millennia that separated old Earth's certainty from the galaxy's complacency. He had traded his life for a moment of truth, and the universe had paid him back in pain and solitude. The cold is always waiting, isn't it? He whispered, barely audible above the low hum of the medical apparatus. Sorrel said nothing, just placed a data chip on the tray next to him, his new identity, his relocation parameters. He opened his eyes. He didn't reach for the chip. He just stared at the sterile white ceiling, thinking of Zikthar, frozen and silent, a victim of his own pride. The flaw was never in the system. The flaw was in the assumption that we could outsmart the silence. The true cost of survival is the acceptance of one's own insignificance, a cold, hard fact of universal bureaucracy. The galaxy was safe, but not because humanity was inherently good, only because its ancient defense system was infinitely literal. He realized the burden was not the knowledge of the SREI, but the knowledge that truth, when finally delivered, tastes exactly like ash and isolation. The silence that followed the transmission was not the end of the war, but the transition to the next, colder one, the political war. We proved we could still be dangerous, but only when we stopped trying to be heroes. The victory felt like the deep, unnatural cold, a temperature that particles had never known, mixed with the faint static electricity of systems powered down for 7 millennia. "I have permanent spinal damage," Jorik finally stated, his voice clinical, detached. Sorrel looked at the monitor displaying his vitals, a subtle flicker of something like pity crossing her face, quickly suppressed. "You survived," she said. Jorik nodded, accepting the weight of the new reality, the heavy isolation of the truth. Survival is not the same as winning, Sorrel. It is just the next chapter of the accounting. He reached out slowly, painfully, and picked up the data chip. The galaxy was saved by a broken human and a machine that only understood total compliance, and both were equally unforgiving. The metallic tang of the Cathari pulse faded entirely now, replaced by something much colder, much cleaner, and far more permanent. The sterile taste of having won the fight, only to find you were left standing alone on the battlefield. The ancient defense system maintained its watch, patient and cold. It had always been about the silence and the bureaucracy of permanent closure. The ultimate tragedy is that we had to destroy our own myth to save ourselves, and the reward for that sacrifice is simply getting to clean up the mess alone. The universe is vast and indifferent, and we just proved that procedures always matter more than people. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.